Chapter 6, Sections 2 through 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 6, Provincial Administration under Augustus, the Western Provinces, 27 B.C. to 14 A.D., Sections 2 through 4. Section 2. Gaul. Augustus divided Gallia into 4 provinces, Narbonensis, Aquitania, Lugudunensis, and Belgica. In 22 B.C. he assigned Narbonensis to the Senate, while the others remained under imperial legati. Narbonensis had become a Roman province in 121 B.C. United with the rest of Gaul after the conquests of Julius Caesar, it was now restored to its separate being. Through the civil wars it became far more than the territory of Narbo, for the federate Greek state of Massilia, which possessed most of the coastline, was reduced to the condition of a provincial town, and thereby Narbonensis extended from the Pyrenees to the maritime Alps. The elder Caesar did much towards Romanizing this province. To him Narbo owed its strength and prosperity, and he founded new cities possessing Roman citizenship, chief among them Arelate, which as a commercial town soon took the place of her older Greek neighbor. The canton system of the Celts was gradually superseded in Narbonensis by the Italian system of city communities, and this development was zealously furthered by Augustus. In one interesting case we can see the process. The canton of the Volcae is first organized on the Italian principle under praetors, praetor Volcarum. The next step is that the canton of the Volcae is replaced by the Latin city Nemausus, which is now Nimes. The disappearance of the canton system distinguishes the southern province from the rest of Gaul, and is part of its conspicuously Roman character. This different degree of Romanization had probably a good deal to do with the marked differences between the lands of the Langue d'Oc and those of the Langue d'Oui. Yet the Celts of Narbonensis did not forget their national gods. The religion of the country survived long in the south as well as in the north. Tres Galliae. The 3 imperial provinces were often grouped together as the 3 Gauls. This threefold division corresponded in general outline to the ethnical division, which Caesar marks at the beginning of his Gallic War. But it does not correspond wholly. The province of the southwest contains Iberian Aquitania, but with a Celtic addition. The Celtic land between the Liger and the Garumna is taken from Celtica and annexed to Aquitania. The province Lugudunensis answers to Caesar's Celtica, but it no longer includes all the Celts. It has lost some on the south side to Aquitania, and others on the north to the third division, Belgica. Thus Belgica is no longer entirely Teutonic, but partly Teutonic and partly Celtic. These 3 districts seem at first to have been placed under the single control of a military governor, who commanded the legions stationed on the Rhine, and had a legatus in each province. Drusus held this position from 13 to 9 B.C., and Tiberius succeeded him, 9 to 7 B.C. Again, from 13 to 17 A.D., we find Germanicus holding the same position. It is possible that in the intervening years this military control was suspended, and that the legati of the 3 provinces were independent of any superior but the Emperor, as they certainly were after 17 A.D. In imperial Gaul the Roman government allowed the cantons to remain, and ordered their administration accordingly. The city system was not introduced in these provinces as in Narbonensis, and the progress of Romanization was much slower. There was a strong national spirit. The religion of the Druids was firmly rooted, and it was long felt by Roman rulers that the presence of armies on the Rhine was as needful to prevent a rebellion in Gaul as to ward off a German invasion. But no serious attempt was made by the Celts to throw off the yoke of their Roman lords. An Iberian rebellion in Aquitania was easily suppressed by Messala Corvinus about 27 B.C., and perhaps belongs as much to the history of Spain as to that of Gaul. The Iberians north of the Pyrenees were probably in communication with their brethren of the south. The success of Messala was rewarded by a triumph. The 4 visits of Augustus to Gaul, which have been mentioned above, and that of Agrippa in 19 B.C., show how much the thoughts of the Emperor were filled with the task of organizing the country which his father had conquered and had not time to shape. On the occasion of his first visit he held a census of Gaul, the first Roman census ever held there, in order to regulate the taxes. It is remarkable that the policy adopted by Rome was not to obliterate, but to preserve a national spirit. Not only was the canton organization preserved, but all the cantons of the 3 provinces were yoked together by a national constitution, quite distinct from the imperial administration, though under imperial patronage. It was in the consulship of M. Messala Barbatus and P. Quirinius (12 B.C.), on the first day of August, that Drusus dedicated an altar to Rome and the genius of Augustus beneath the hill of Lugudunum, where the priest of the 3 Gauls should henceforward sacrifice yearly, on the same day, to those deities. The priest was to be elected annually by those whom the cantons of the 3 provinces chose to represent them in a national concilium held at Lugudunum. Among the rights of this assembly were that of determining the distribution of the taxes, and that of lodging complaints against the acts of imperial officials. The city which was thus chosen to be the meeting place of the Gallic peoples under Roman auspices, Lugudunum, stood above and apart from the other communities of imperial Gaul. She gave her name to one of the 3 provinces, and the governor of Lugudunensis dwelt within her walls. But she was far more than a provincial residence. Singular by her privileged position as the one city in the 3 Gauls which enjoyed the rights of Roman citizenship, she may be regarded as the capital of all 3, yet not belonging to any. Her exalted position resembles that of Rome in Italy rather than that of Alexandria in Egypt. It has also been compared with that of Washington in the United States. She and Carthage were the only cities in the western subject lands in which, as in Rome itself, a garrison was stationed. She had the right of coining imperial gold, and we cannot assert this of any other western city. Her position, rising at the meeting of the Rhone from the east, and the Arar Sound from the north, was advantageous from the point of view either of a merchant or of a soldier. She was the centre of the road system of Gaul which was worked out by Agrippa, and whenever an emperor visited his Gallic provinces, Lugudunum was naturally his headquarters. The difference in development between the 3 Gauls and Narbonensis, the land of cantons and the land of cities, is well illustrated by the town names of France. In Narbonensis the local names superseded for ever the tribal names. Arelate, Vienna, Valentia survive in Arles, Vienne, Valence. But in imperial Gaul the rule is that the local names fell into disuse, and the towns are called at the present day by the names of the old Gallic tribes. Lutetia, the city of the Parisii, is Paris. Durocotorum, the city of the Remi, is Rheims. Avaricum, the city of the Bituriges, is Bourges. The Conqueror of Gaul had shown the way to the conquest of Britain, but this work was reserved for another than his son. One of the objects of Augustus in visiting Gaul in 27 B.C. was to feel his way towards an invasion of the northern island, but the project was abandoned. The legions of Augustus, however, though they did not cross the Channel, crossed the Rhine, but the story of the making of the true and original province of Germany beyond the Rhine and its brief duration, and of the forming of the spurious Germanies on the left bank of the river, will be told in another chapter. Section 3. Spain. Spain, the land of the far west in the Old World, was safe through its geographical position from the invasion of a foe. Almost enclosed by the sea, it had no frontier exposed to the menace of a foreign power, and it was the only province in such a situation that required the constant presence of a military force. For though the Romanizing of the southern and eastern parts had advanced with wonderful rapidity, the intractable peoples of the northwestern regions refused to accept the yoke of the conqueror, and held out in the mountain fastnesses, from which they descended to plunder their southern neighbors. The Cantabrians and the Asturians were the most important of these warlike races, and, when Augustus founded the Empire, their territories could hardly be considered as yet really under the sway of Rome. Since the death of Caesar arms had never been laid down in Spain. Commanders were ever winning triumphs there, and ever having to begin anew. Augustus found it needful to keep no less than 3 legions in the country, 1 in Cambria, 2 in Asturia; and the memory of the Asturian army still abides in the name Leon, the place where the Legio VII Gemina was stationed. Before Augustus, the province of Hispania Ulterior took in the land of the Tagus and the Durius, as well as the region of the Baetis. This division was now altered. First of all Galatia, the northwestern corner, was transferred from the further to the hither province, so that all the fighting in the disturbed districts of the north and northwest might devolve upon the same commander. The next step was the separation of Lusitania, and its organization as a distinct imperial province, while the rest of further Spain, Baetica as it came to be called, was placed under the control of the senate. Another change made by Augustus was the removal of the seat of government in hither Spain from New Carthage to more northern and more central Tarraco, whence, from this time forth, the province was called Tarraconensis. Tarraco became in this province what Lugudunum was in Gaul, the chief seat of the worship of Rome and Augustus, and the meeting place of the provincial concilium. Thus, under the new order of things, Spain consists of 3 provinces, Baetica, senatorial, Tarraconensis and Lusitania, imperial. This arrangement was probably not completed until the end of the Cantabrian War, which lasted with few interruptions from 29 to 25 B.C., only, however, to break out again a year or 2 later. A rebellion of Cantabria and Asturia was suppressed by Statilius Taurus in 29 B.C., but in 27 B.C. disturbances were renewed and the Emperor himself hastened from Gaul to quell the insurrection. But a serious illness at Tarraco forced him to leave the conduct of the war to his legati, probably under the general direction of Agrippa. A fleet on the north coast supported the operations by land, and by degrees the fastnesses of the Cantabrians fell into the hands of the Romans. At the same time P. Carcisius subdued the Asturians. It was a more difficult task to secure a lasting pacification. Augustus endeavoured to induce the mountain peoples to settle in the plains, where in the neighbourhood of Roman colonies they might be tamed and civilized. Such centres of Roman life in the northwest were Augusta Asturica, Bracara Augusta, Lucus Augusti, memorials of the Spanish visit of Augustus, and still surviving under their old names as Astorga, Braga, and Lugo. The chief inland town of eastern Tarraconensis was the work of the same statesman. Saragossa, on the Ebro, still preserves the name of the colony of Caesar Augustus. But the Emperor had not left Spain long (24 B.C.), when new disturbances broke out. They were promptly put down, but in 22 B.C. another rebellion of the Cantabrians and Asturians called for the joint action of the governors of Tarraconensis and Lusitania. The last war, and perhaps the most serious of all, was waged 2 years later, and demanded the leadership of Marcus Agrippa himself (20 to 19 B.C.). The difficulty was at first aggravated by the mutiny of the soldiers, who detested the weary and doubtful warfare in the mountains, and it required all the military experience of the general to restore their discipline and zeal. After many losses the war was successfully ended (19 B.C.), and the hitherto untamable Cantabrian people reduced to insignificance. A few disturbances occurred 4 years later, but were easily dealt with. Yet it was still felt to be needful to keep a strong military force in northern Spain. Roman civilization had soon taken a firm hold in the south of Spain. The contrast of Narbonensis with the rest of Gaul is like the contrast of Baetica and the eastern side of the hither province with the rest of Spain. But Roman policy was very different in the 2 countries. And this was due to the circumstance that Spain was conquered and organized at an earlier period. The Latinizing of Spain had been carried far under the Republic. The Latinizing of Gaul had practically begun under the Empire. In Gaul the tribal canons were allowed to remain. This was the policy of the Caesars, father and son. In Spain, the the tribal cantons were broken up in smaller divisions. This was the policy of the republican senate. In Gaul, excluding the southern province, there were no Roman cities except Lugudunum. In Spain Roman colonies were laid here and there in all parts. The Gallic fellows of Baetic Gades, Corduba and Hispalis, of Lusitanian Emerita and Olispo, of Tarraconese Carthage, Caesar Augusta and Bracara, must be sought altogether, under the early Empire, in the smallest of the 4 provinces of Gaul. In Lusitania Augustus founded Emerita Augusta, a colony of veterans, on the river Anas (Guadiana), and made it the capital of the province. The other chief Roman towns of Lusitania were Olispo, once promoted to be the capital (Lisbon) of a modern kingdom, and Pax Julia, now represented by Beja. Spain was not a network of the Roman roads like Gaul. The only imperial road was the Via Augusta, which went from the north of Italy along the coast to Narbo, then across the pass of Puicerda to Ilerda, and on by Tarasco and Valentia to the mouth of the Baetis. The other road, communication necessary in a fertile and prosperous country, was provided by the local communities. The Spanish peninsula was rich not only in metals, but in wine, oil, and corn. Gades (Cadiz), which now received the name of Augusta Julia, was one of the richest and most luxurious towns in the Empire. SECT. IV. — AFRICA, SARDINIA, SICILY. From Spain one naturally goes on to Africa. Augustus never visited either the African province or the African dependency, but, before he left Tarraco (25 B.C.), he was called upon to deal with African affairs. In history Spain and Africa have always been closely connected. Sometimes Spain has been the stepping stone to Africa, oftener, as for the Phoenicians and the Arabs, Africa has been the stepping stone to Spain. The western half of Mauretania was really nearer to the European peninsula which faced it than to the rest of the African coast, and under the later Empire this region went with Spain and Gaul, not with Africa and Italy. There was no road between Tingis in western and Caesarea in eastern Mauretania; the communication was by sea. And so it was that the Moorish hordes, crossing to Baetica in their boats, were more dangerous to Roman subjects in Spain than to those in Africa. A poet of Nero's time describes Baetica as Trusibus obnoxia maris. For though Spain, as has been already said, had no frontier exposed to a foreign power, her southern province had as close neighbour a land which, first as a dependency and then as a province, was inhabited by a rude and untamed population. The commands which Augustus issued from the capital of his Spanish province especially regarded Mauretania. But we must call to mind what had taken place in Africa since the dictator Caesar ordered it anew. He had increased the Roman province by the addition of the kingdom of Numidia, and the river Ampsaga was fixed as the western boundary between New Africa, as Numidia was sometimes called, and Mauretania. This latter country was at that time under 2 kings. Over the eastern realm of Eol, soon to be called by Caesar's name, ruled King Bocchus. Over the western realm of Tingis ruled King Bogud. Both these potentates had taken Caesar's side in the first civil war, unlike King Juba, and they therefore kept their kingdoms after Caesar's victory. But in the next civil war they did not both take the same side. Bocchus held to Caesar the son, as he had held to Caesar the father, but Bogud supported Antonius, while his own capital Tingis (Tangier) embraced the other cause. In reward Bocchus was promoted to kingship over the whole of Mauretania, and Tingis received the privilege of Roman citizenship. When Bocchus died, 33 B.C., his kingdom was left kingless for a season, but the Roman government did not think that the time had yet come for a province of Mauretania. A son of the last king of Numidia, called Juba, like his father, had followed the dictator's triumph through the streets of Rome, and had been brought up under the care of Caesar and his successor. He served in the Roman army. He was an eager student of Greek and Roman literature, and wrote or compiled Greek books himself. On him Augustus fixed to take the place of King Bocchus. If it was out of the question to restore him to his paternal kingdom of Numidia, he should at least have the next thing to it, the kingdom of Mauretania. And as the descendant of King Massinissa, he would be welcome to the natives. At the same time, 25 B.C., Augustus gave Mauretania a queen. The daughter of Antonius and the Egyptian queen had followed his own triumph, as Juba had followed his father's. Named Cleopatra like her mother, she had been protected and educated by the noble kindness of Octavia, whom her parents had so deeply wronged. There had been a peculiar fitness, as has been well remarked, in the union of the Numidian prince and the Egyptian princess, whose fortunes were so like. This union brought about the strange circumstance that the last king of Mauretania, Juba's son, bore the name of Ptolemy. Thus Roman dominion in Africa, west of Egypt, consisted under Augustus of a province and a dependent kingdom, the river Ampsaga, on which Cirta is built, forming the boundary. The southern boundaries of this dominion it would have been hard, perhaps, for Augustus himself to fix, inasmuch as there were no neighbouring states. The real dominion passed insensibly into a sphere of influence among the native races, who were alternatively submissive and hostile, or, as the Romans would have said, rebellious. Against these dangerous neighbours of the interior, Garamantes and invincible Gaetulians, Transtagnenses and Musulami, it was necessary to keep a legion in Africa, which was thus distinguished as the only senatorial province whose proconsul commanded an army. 2 expeditions were made in the reign of Augustus against these enemies, the first under the proconsul L. Cornelius Balbus, 19 B.C., against the Garamantes, and a second under P. Sulpicius Quirinius against the tribes of Marmarica further east. Barbus performed his task ably, and received a triumph, remarkable as the last granted to any private Roman citizen. In the organization of Gaul and Spain, Rome had no older civilization to build upon. It was otherwise in Sicily and Africa. The civilization of Sicily, when it became Roman, was chiefly Greek, but partly Phoenician. That of Africa, on the contrary, was chiefly Phoenician, but partly Greek. Accordingly Rome built on Phoenician foundations in the lands which she won from Carthage, and accepted the constitution of the Phoenician town communities, just as she accepted the cantons in Gaul. But there was a remarkable likeness in organization between these communities and those of Italy, so that the transition from the one form to the other was soon and easily accomplished. Carthage, whose existence was blotted out by the short-sighted policy of the Republican Senate, had been revived by the generous counsels of Caesar, to become soon the capital of Roman, as it had been of Punic, Africa. At first the Phoenician constitution was restored to her, but she soon received the form of a Roman colonia, and grew to be one of the greatest and most luxurious cities of western Europe. Utica, jealous of the resurrection of her old rival, was made a Roman municipium. The growth of Roman life in Africa was also furthered by the settlement of colonies of veterans. In the original province may be mentioned Culpea and Hippodiarhytos; in Numidia, Cirta, Constantine, and Sicca. In Roman civilization, Mauretania was far behind her eastern neighbours, but Augustus did much in establishing colonies, chiefly on the coast. These Roman towns of Mauretania owed no allegiance to the native king, but depended directly on the governor of the neighbouring province. Besides the Phoenician towns and the towns on Italian model, whether municipia or colonies, there were also native Libyan communities, but these stood directly under the control of the Roman governors, or sometimes were placed under special Roman prefects. The language of the native Berbers was still spoken chiefly in the regions which the Romans least frequented. It was treated by the conquerors like the Iberian in Spain and the Celtic in Gaul. The language of communication throughout northern Africa was Phoenician, but Rome refused to recognize this Asiatic tongue as an official language, as she had recognized Greek in her eastern provinces. In their local affairs the communities might use Phoenician, but once they entered into imperial relations, Latin was prescribed. It might have been thought that Greek, which was better known in Africa than Latin when the Romans came, would have been adopted there as the imperial language. But the government decreed that Africa, like Sicily, was to belong to the Latin West. It is instructive to observe that, While the name of the Greek queen of Mauretania appears on coins in Greek, that of her husband, who was regarded as an imperial official, is always in Latin. Africa was fertile in fruit, though her wine could not compete with the produce of Spain and Italy. In corn she was especially rich, and shared with Egypt and Sicily the privilege of supplying Rome. The purple industry was still active, chiefly in the little island of Gerba, not destined indeed to become as famous as the island of Tyre. Juba introduced this industry on the western coast of his kingdom. The general well-being of the land has ample witnesses in the remains of splendid structures which have been found there, in all parts, such as theatres, baths, and triumphal arches. From Africa we pass to another province in which Rome was the heiress of Carthage. Sardinia had ceased to look to her African ruler in 238 B.C., and had become, 7 years later, a Roman province, the earliest except Sicily. In the division of the provinces in 27 B.C., Sardinia and Corsica fell to the senate and Roman people. But the descents of pirates forced Augustus to take the province into his own hands in 6 A.D., and commit it to the protection of soldiers. He did not place it, however, under a legatus of senatorial rank, but only under a procurator of equestrian rank. It was destined to pass again to the senate under Nero, but returned to the Emperor finally in the reign of Vespasian. These islands, though placed in the midst of civilization, were always barbarous and remote. The rugged nature of Corsica, the pestilential air of its southern fellow, did not invite settlements or visitors. They were more suited to be places of exile, and they were used as such. Augustus sent no colonies thither, and did not visit them himself. The chief value of Sardinia lay in its large production and export of grain. Very different was the other great island of the Mediterranean, the oldest of all the provinces of Rome, the land whose conquest led to the further conquests of Sardinia and of Africa itself. It was in Sicily that the younger Caesar established his position in the west. His recovery of the land, on which Rome depended for her grain, first set his influence and popularity on a sure foundation. As Augustus, he visited it again B.C. 22, and although it was a senatorial province, ordered its affairs by virtue of his maius imperium at Syracuse. Perhaps it was in memory of this visit that he gave the name of Syracuse to a room in his house which he used as a retreat when he wished to suffer no interruption. Roman policy had decreed that Sicily was to belong to the Latin West, not to the Greek East, with which once she had been so constantly connected; and for centuries to come, embosomed in the centre of the empire, she plays no part in history, such as she had played in the past, and was destined to play again in the distant future. End of chapter 6, sections 2 through 4. Sections 5 and 6 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 6, Provincial Administration under Augustus, the Western Provinces, 27 B.C. to 14 A.D., Sections 5 and 6. Section 5. Raetia, Noricum, and the Alpine districts. From the province adjoining Italy on the south, we pass to the lands on its northern frontier, which it devolved upon Augustus to conquer and to shape. The towns of northern Italy were constantly exposed to the descents of unreclaimed Alpine tribes, who could not be fully quelled as long as they possessed a land of refuge beyond the mountains, among the kindred barbarians of Raetia. For the security of Italy it was imperative to subdue these troublesome neighbours, and in order to do so effectively it was necessary to occupy Raetia and Vindelicia. This task was accomplished without difficulty in 15 B.C. by the stepsons of the Emperor. Drusus invaded Raetia from the south and vanquished the enemy in battle. Tiberius, who was then governor of Gaul, marched from the north to assist him, and the Vindelici were defeated in a naval action on the waters of the Lake of Brigantium. The tribes of the "restless Genuani" and the swift Breuni, appear to have played a prominent part in the Vindelician war. The decisive battle which gave Raetia to Rome was fought near the sources of the Danube, under the fortunate auspices of Tiberius, on the 1st of August. By these campaigns the countries which corresponded to Bavaria, Tyrol, and eastern Switzerland became Roman; a new military frontier was secured, and direct communications were established between northern Italy and the upper Danube and upper Rhine. The military province of Raetia was placed under an imperial prefect, and the troops which used to be stationed in Cisalpine Gaul could now be transferred to an advanced position. Augusta Vindelicium was founded as a military station near the frontier of the new province, and still continues under the name of Augsburg, the name of the ruler who did so much in Romanizing western Europe. For Romanizing Raetia itself, indeed, neither he nor his successors did much. No Roman towns were founded there, as in the neighbouring province of Noricum. The conquest of the dangerous Selaci, who inhabited the valley of the Duria, between the Gralan and the Pennine Alps, was successfully accomplished by Terentius Murena, brother-in-law of Maecenas, in 25 B.C. The people was exterminated, and a body of praetorian soldiers was settled in the valley, through which roads ran over the Gralan Alps to Lugudunum, and over the Pennine into Raetia. The new city was called Augustus Praetoria. The Emperor's name survives in the modern Aosta, where the old Roman walls and grates are still to be seen. The western Alps between Gaul and Italy were formed into two small districts, the Maritime Alps and the Cottian Alps, of which the former was governed by imperial prefects. At first the Cottian district formed a dependent state, not under a Roman commander, but under its own prince Cottius, from whom it derived its name, Reginum Cottii. Owing to his ready submission, he was left in possession of his territory, with the title Prefectus Civitatium. His capital Segusio survives as Susa, and the arch which he erected in honour of his overlord Augustus, 8 B.C., is still standing. Through this prefecture, as it seems to have been, ran the Via Cottia from Augusta Taurinorum, Turin, to Arelate, Arles. The pacification of the Alps, though it presented nothing brilliant to attract historians, conferred a solid and lasting benefit on Italy, and Italy gratefully recognised this by a monument which she set up in honour of the Emperor on a hill on the Mediterranean coast near Monaco. The reduction of 46 Alpine peoples is recorded in the inscription, which has been preserved. Few relics of the Roman occupation have been found in Raetia. It is otherwise with the neighbouring province of Noricum, which included the lands now called Styria and Carinthia, along with a part of Carniola and most of Austria. Here traffic had prepared the way for Roman subjugation. Roman customs and the Latin tongue were known beyond the Carnic Alps, and when the time came for the land to become directly dependent on Rome, no difficulty was experienced. An occasion presented itself in 16 B.C., when some of the Noric tribes joined their neighbours, the Pannonians, in a plundering incursion into Istria. At first treated as a dependent kingdom, Noricum soon passed into the condition of an imperial province under a prefect or procurator, but continued to be called Regnum Noricum. No legions were stationed in either Raetia or Noricum, only auxiliary troops; but the former province was held in check by legions of the Rhine army at Vindonissa, and Noricum was likewise surveyed by legions of the Pannonian army, stationed at Poetovio, on the Drava (Drave). The organisation of Noricum on the model of Italy was carried out by the Emperor Claudius. The land immediately beyond the Julian Alps, with the towns of Emona and Nauportus, belonged to Illyricum, not to Noricum, but it subsequently became a part of Italy. The occupation of Raetia and Noricum was of great and permanent importance for the military defence of the Empire against the barbarians of Central Europe. A line of communication was secured between the armies on the Danube and the armies on the Rhine. SECT. 6. Illyricum and the Haemus lands. Pannonia and Dalmatia. The subjugation of Illyricum was the work of the first Emperor. Istria and Dalmatia were counted as Roman lands under the Republic, but the tribes of the interior maintained their independence, and plundered their civilized neighbours in Macedonia. Roman legions had been destroyed, and the eagles captured by these untamed peoples in 48 B.C. under Gabinius, and in 44 B.C. under Vatinius. To avenge these defeats was demanded by Roman honour, and to pacify the interior districts was demanded by Roman policy. The younger Caesar undertook this task, when he had dealt with Sextus Pompeius, and discharged it with energy and success. In 35 B.C. he subdued the smaller tribes all along the Hadriatic coast, beginning with Doclea, which is now Montenegro, near the borders of the Macedonian province, and ending with the Iapydes, who lived in the Alpine district northeast of Istria. At the same time his fleet subdued the pirates who infested the coast islands, especially Curzola and Melita. The Iapydes, whose depredations extended to northern Italy, and who had ventured to attack places like Tergeste and Aquileia, offered a strenuous resistance. When the Roman army approached, most of the population assembled in their town Arupium, but as Caesar drew nearer fled into the forests. The strong fortress of Matulum, built on two summits of a wooded hill, gave more trouble. It was defended by a garrison of 3,000 chosen warriors, who foiled all the Roman plans of attack, until Caesar, with Agrippa by his side, led his soldiers against the walls. On this occasion Caesar received some bodily injuries. The energy of the Romans, inspirited by the example of their leader, induced the besieged to capitulate; but when the Romans on entering the town demanded the surrender of their arms, the Iapydes, thinking that they were betrayed, made a desperate resistance in which most of them were slain; and the remainder, having slain the women and children, set fire to their town. Having thus subdued the Iapydes, Caesar marched through their country down the river Colapis (Culpa), which flows into the Save, and laid siege to the Pannonian fortress of Siscia, whose name is preserved in Sissek, situated at the junction of the two streams. It was not the first time that a Roman force had appeared before the walls of Siscia, but it was the first time that a Roman force did not appear in vain. Having thrown a bridge across the river, Caesar surrounded the stronghold with earthworks and ditches, and with the assistance of some tribes on the Danube, got together a small flotilla on the Save, so that he could operate against the town by water as well as by land. The Pannonian friends of the besieged place made an attempt to relieve it, but were beaten back with loss; and having held out for 30 days, Siscia was taken by storm. A strong position was thus secured for further operations, whether against the Pannonians or against the Dacians. A Roman fortress was built, and garrisoned with 25 cohorts under the command of Fufius Geminus. Caesar returned to Italy towards the end of the year, 35 B.C., but during the winter the conquered Pannonian tribe rebelled, and Fufius came into great straits. Dark rumours of his situation, for he was unable to send a sure message, reached Caesar, who was at that moment planning an expedition to Britain. He immediately hastened to the relief of Siscia, and let the Britannic enterprise fall through. Having delivered Fufius from the danger, he returned to Dalmatia, and spent the rest of the year 34 B.C. in reducing the inland tribes, which now, forgetting their tribal feuds, combined in a great federation to fight for their freedom. They mustered an army of 12,000 strong, and took up a position at Pomona, now Teplin, northeast of Sebenico, a place impregnable by nature, and strengthened further by art. The name of their leader was Versus. By a skillful piece of strategy Caesar forced the enemy to give up their advanced lines of defence and retreat into the fortress, which he prepared to reduce by starving the garrison out, and for this purpose built a wall 5 miles in circuit. Another large Dalmatian force under Testimus came to relieve the place, but was completely defeated. The defenders of Promona simultaneously made an excursion against the besiegers, but were driven back, and some of their pursuers penetrated into the fortress with them. A few days later it was surrendered. The fall of Promona put an end to the war, in so far as it was waged by the Dalmatians in common. But warfare continued here and there. Various tribes and fortresses held out by themselves. It was necessary to besiege Setovia, and Caesar was wounded there in his knee. He returned after this to Rome, to enter upon his second consulship (33 B.C.), leaving the completion of his work to Statilius Taurus, who for his services on this occasion received a large share of the Illyrian spoils, and laid the foundation of his great wealth. But Caesar laid down his consulate on the very day on which he assumed it, and returned to Dalmatia, in order to receive the submission of the conquered peoples. The eagles which had been captured from the army of Gabinius were restored, and 700 boys were given to the conqueror as hostages. The civilizing of these Illyrian lands was now begun in earnest. The chief towns on the coast were raised to the position of Italian communities, and a new epoch began in the history of Salone, Iader, Pola, Tergeste, and other places, which made their mark in the later history of Europe. It was now, doubtless, that colonies were settled at Salone, Pola, and Emona. Thus Salone became in full official language Colonia Martia Julia Salone, and Emona, which corresponds with Laibach, the capital of Carniola, became Colonia Julia Emona. Pola, called Colonia Pietas Julia Pola, may have become in some measure for Illyricum what Lugudunum was for the Three Gauls, in so far as a temple of Rome and Augustus was built there during the lifetime of the first Emperor. A change was also made in the administration of Illyricum. Hitherto it had been joined to the government of Cisalpine Gaul, with the exception of a small strip of land in the south of Dalmatia, which was annexed to Macedonia. But after Caesar's campaigns, Illyricum was promoted to the dignity of a separate province, bounded by the Savus in the north and the Drillo in the south. At the division of provinces in 27 B.C., it was assigned to the senate. But in the nature of things it could not long remain senatorial. The presence of legions on the northern frontier could not be dispensed with, and it devolved upon the governor to watch over Noricum on the one hand and Moesia on the other. Such powers and responsibilities were not likely to be left to a proconsul, and accordingly soon after the conquest of Raetia, when hostilities in Pannonia seemed likely to break out, we find Agrippa sent thither (13 B.C.), invested "with greater powers than all the governors out of Italy." The terror of Agrippa's name held the Pannonians in check, but on his death in the following year they took up arms, and Tiberius was appointed to succeed Agrippa. He brought the rebellious tribes to submission, but in the next year (11 B.C.) was again compelled to take the field against them, and also to suppress a revolt of the Dalmatians. These events led to the transference of Illyricum from the senate to the Emperor. Both the Dalmatian subjects and the Pannonian neighbours required the constant presence of military forces. At the same time the northern frontier of the province advanced from the Savus to the Dravus, in consequence of the successes of Tiberius in his 3 campaigns, 12 to 10 B.C. Potovio, on the borders of Noricum, now became the advanced station of the legions, instead of Siscia. This extension of territory soon led to a division of Illyricum into 2 provinces, Pannonia and Dalmatia, both imperial. The government of Pannonia was especially important, because the intervention of the legatus might be called for either in Noricum or in Moesia. It is well to notice that the name Illyricum was used in 2 ways. In its stricter sense it included Pannonia and Dalmatia. In a wider sense, and specially for financial purposes, it took in Noricum and Moesia, as coming within the sphere of the governors of Illyricum proper. Moesia and Thrace. The governors of Macedonia under the Republic were constantly troubled by the hostilities of the rude Illyric and Thracian peoples on the north and east. The Dardanians of the upper Margus, the Dentheletae of the Strymon, the Triballi between the Timacus and the Oascus, and the Bessi beyond the Rhodope were troublesome neighbours. The lands between the Danube and Mount Haemus, which now form the Principality of Bulgaria, were inhabited by the Moesians, and beyond the Danube was the dominion of the Dacians, whom the Romans had reason to regard as a most formidable enemy. The Thracians in the south, the Moesians in the centre, and the Dacians in the north, were people of the same race, speaking the same tongue. It was evidently a very important matter for the Roman government to break this line, and to bring Moesia and Thrace directly or indirectly under Roman sway, so as to make the Ister the frontier of the empire. The occasion of the conquest of Moesia was an invasion of the Bastarnse, a powerful people, perhaps of German race, who lived between the Danube and the Dniester, in 29 B.C. As long as they confined their hostilities to the Moesians, Dardanians, and Triballi, the matter did not concern the governor of Macedonia, Marcus Licinius Crassus, grandson of the rival of Pompey and Caesar. But when they attacked the Dentheletas, allies of Rome, he was called on to interfere. The Bastarnse retired at his command, but he followed them as they retreated and defeated them where the river Cibrus flows into the Danube. But at the same time he turned his arms against Moesia, and reduced, not without considerable toil and hardships, almost all the tribes of that country. He had also to deal with the Serdi, who dwelt in the centre of the peninsula under Mount Scomius, in the direct way between Macedonia and Moesia. These he conquered, and took their chief place, Serdica, which is now Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. He was also compelled to reduce the unfriendly tribes of Thrace. In that country the worship of Dionysus was cultivated with wild enthusiasm, and the possession of one specially venerable grove, consecrated to that god, perhaps the very grove in which Alexander the Great had once sacrificed, was a subject of discord between two powerful rival tribes, the Odrysae and the Bessae. The Bessae were then in possession, but Crassus took the sacred place from them, and gave it to the friendly Odrysae, and constituted their prince the representative of Roman power in Thrace, with lordship over the other peoples, and protector of the Greek towns on the coast. Thus Thrace became a dependent kingdom. That Moesia also became, at first, a dependency of the same kind, before she became a regular province, seems likely. The Greek cities on the coast were probably placed under the protection of the Thracian kingdom, while the rest of Moesia and Triballia may have been united under one of the native princes. After 27 B.C. it would doubtless have devolved upon the governor of Illyricum, no longer upon the governor of Macedonia, to intervene in case of need. The submission of the Thracians was not permanent, and the Odrysians were not equal to the task imposed upon them. The Bessae longed to recover the sanctuary of Dionysus, and a sacred war broke out in 13 B.C., which resulted in the overthrow of the princes of Odrysae. The suppression of this insurrection ought perhaps to have devolved upon the governor of Illyricum, but he had his hands full in his own province. The proconsul of Macedonia had no army at his disposal. Accordingly recourse was had to the troops stationed at Galatia, and Lucius Piso, the imperial legatus in that province, was summoned to cross into Europe and quell the insurgents who were threatening to invade Asia, having established themselves in the Thracian Chersonese (11 B.C.). Piso put down the revolt successfully, and it was probably soon after this that Moesia was converted into a regular Roman province, though Thrace still remained under the rule of the dependent Odrysian prince, Rhometalces, who, with his son Cotys, was devotedly attached to Rome and unpopular in Thrace. Thrace, though not yet Greek, must even now be reckoned to the Greek half of the Roman world. But its close connection with Moesia naturally led us to consider it in this place rather than in the following chapter. Moesia itself belonged partly to the Latin and partly to the Greek division. The cities which grew under Roman influence in western Moesia were Latin, the cities on the coast of Pontus were Greek, and formed a distinct world of their own. But most of the inhabitants of these cities were not Greeks, but Gretae and Sarmatians, and even the true Greeks were to some extent barbarized by intercourse with the natives. The poet Ovid, who was banished to Tomi, gives a lively description of the wild life there, the ploughmen ploughing armed, the arrows of ferocious marauders flying over the walls of the town, natives clad in skins, and equipped with bow and quiver, riding through the streets. Getic continued to be spoken in Moesia long after the Roman conquest, like a lyric in Illyricum, and Ovid says that it was quite needful for any one resident in Tomi to know it. He wrote himself a poem in the Getic tongue, and we should be glad to barter some of his Latin elegiacs for his exercise in that lost language. The subjugation of the vast extent of territory, reaching from the sources of the Rhine to the mouths of the Danube, was a military necessity. The conquest of each province, while it served some immediate purpose at the time, was also part of an immense scheme for the defence of the Empire from the northern ocean to the Euxine. It was designed that the armies in Pannonia should be in constant touch with the armies on the Rhine, and that operations in both quarters should be carried out in connection. Central Europe and the Germans who inhabited it presented a hard and urgent problem to the Roman government, but before telling how they attempted to solve it, it will be well to complete our survey of the subject and dependent lands. End of chapter 6, sections 5 and 6.
Chapter 7, Section 1 and 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 7, The Provincial Administration under Augustus, the Eastern Provinces. 27 B.C. to 14 A.D. Sections 1 and 2. Chapter 7. Provincial Administration continued. The Eastern Provinces and Egypt. Function of Roman rule in the East. Macedonia, Achaia, and the free Greek states. Nicopolis and the Actian Games. The Delphic Amphictyony. Asia and Bithynia. The Provincial Diets. Asiarchs and Bithyniarchs, Galatia and Pamphylia, the dependent states in Asia Minor, the Lycian Confederacy, Cappadocia, Pontus, Paphlagonia, Little Armenia, the states of the Tauric Peninsula, Bosphorus and Chersonesus, the insular provinces, Cyprus and Crete with Cyrene, Syria and the neighboring dependent states, Nabatea, Judea, Commagene, Chalcis, Abila, Emesa, Palmyra, King Herod and his Hellenism, Egypt. The Romans, who were the teachers of the peoples whom they conquered in the West, were themselves pupils in the East. In Gaul, in Spain, in northern Italy, in Illyricum, they broke new ground and appeared as the pioneers of civilization. But in the eastern countries which came under their dominion, they entered upon an inheritance, which they were called upon indeed to preserve and improve, but where there was no room for them to originate new ideas of development. Rome merely carried on the work of Alexander the Great and his successors, and she was proud to be entrusted with the task. She not only left Greek what was already Greek, but she endeavored to spread Greek civilization in those parts of her eastern lands where it had not taken root. The sole exception to this policy was Sicily, and this was due to its geographical position. The subject lands of the East naturally fall into four groups. 1. Macedonia and Greece. 2. Asia Minor, in connection with which may be considered the Tauric Peninsula. 3. Syria and the neighboring vassal kingdoms. 4. Egypt, which stands by itself, both geographically and because, strictly speaking, it was not a province. Section 1. Macedonia, Achaia, and the free Greek states. The institution of the empire was attended by a change in the administration of Macedonia and Greece, which under the Republic had formed one large province. Augustus divided it into two smaller provinces, Macedonia and Achaia, both of which he assigned to the Senate. This division, however, did not altogether coincide with the boundary between Greece and Macedonia. The province of Achaia was smaller than Hellas, and the new province of Macedonia larger than Macedonia proper, for Thessaly, Aetolia, Acarnania, and Epirus were placed under the rule of the northern proconsul. Thus Mount Aetna, instead of Mount Olympus, was the boundary between Greece and Macedonia. Imperial Macedonia was thus smaller in extent and importance than republican Macedonia. It also lost its military significance as a frontier district through the extension of Roman rule over the neighboring lands north and east. Greek civilization, though it had flourished for centuries in the old cities on both the seas which wash the coasts of Macedonia, never penetrated far into the highlands. Eastward of Apollonia and Dyrrachium, northward of Thessalonica and the Chalcidic peninsula, there were few Greek cities to form centers of culture. Augustus settled colonies of Roman citizens in many of the old Greek towns, in Dyrrachium, the old Epidamnos, and in Bilus, on the Adriatic coast, in Thracian Philippi, in Pella, in Dium, on the Thermea Gulf, in Cassandra, on the Bay of Pagasai. But his purpose was merely to provide for veteran soldiers, not to Romanize the province. In general, the towns retained their Macedonian constitutions and politarchs, and they formed a federation with a diet. The capital of the province was Thessalonica, and this alone stamped it as Greek. Thessaly, although placed under the government of the proconsul of Macedonia, held a position quite apart from the lands north of Mount Olympus. It was a purely Greek district, and its cities formed a federation of its own, distinct from that of Macedonia. The diet used to meet at Larissa, whose fertile plain was so famous. Julius Caesar had accorded the right of free self-government to all the Thessalians, but for some act of misconduct Augustus withdrew the privilege, and the Thessalians, with the single exception of Pharsalus, were degraded from the position of allies to that of subjects. The Roman government, whether republican or imperial, always treated the venerable cities of Greece with a consideration and tenderness which they showed to no other conquered lands. The reverence which was inspired in the Romans by the city of the Virgin Pallas, by patient Lacedaemon, and by oracular Delphi, is displayed not only in their literature, but in their government. Athens preserved a part of her dominion as well as her independence. She can still regard herself as a sovereign city. Thus Greek fell politically into two parts, federate Greece and subject Greece. First of the free federate states comes Athens, with the whole of Attica and various other dependencies. On the mainland she possessed Haliartos in Boeotia and the surrounding district, but, as in old days, most of her dominion was insular. Among the Cyclades she had Chios and Delos, in the northern Aegean, Lemnos, Imbros, and Skyros. The island of Salamis was also recovered for her in the reign of Augustus, by the private liberality of a rich man, Julius Nicanor, whom the grateful Athenians named the new Themistocles. In spite of her privileged position, perhaps in consequence of it, Athens often gave the Roman government trouble. A revolt in the reign of Augustus is recorded. Next to Athens in northern Greece came three famous Boeotian towns, Thespiae, Tanagra, and Plataea. In Phocis likewise three, Delphi, Elatea, and Abae. In Locris, Amphissa. In the Peloponnesus, Sparta was permitted to retain her dominion over northern Laconia, while the inhabitants of the southern half of that country were formed into 18 communities of free Laconians, Eleuthero-Lacones. Dyme in Achaia was also a free city, and it is highly probable, though not certain, that Elis and Olympia belonged to the free communities. The Roman government interfered as little as possible with the affairs of these free states. Athens coined her own drachmae and obols, and the head of Caesar never appeared on her coins. But she and her fellows knew that their privileges might at any moment be withdrawn, as the example of the Thessalians taught them. Patra and Corinth, as Roman colonies, held a somewhat different position. Corinth, like Carthage, rose again under the auspices of Julius Caesar, as Colonia Julia, or Laus Julia, and rapidly recovered her prosperity thanks to her geographical position. Patrae in Achaia was founded by Augustus, who settled there a large number of Italian veterans, and granted to the new town dominion over the Locrian haven Naupactus, which lay over against it on the opposite coast. The rest of Greece, with the exception of the less developed districts in the west, Aetolia, Acarnania, Epirus, constituted the province of Achaia. The residence of the proconsul was at Corinth. The sense of national unity in these subject states was encouraged by Augustus. he received the Achaean League in an extended form as the League of Boeotians, Euboeans, Locrians, Phocians, and Dorians, or briefly, the League of the Achaeans. In later times it assumed the more pretentious title of the League of the Panhellenes. The assemblies of this association used to meet in Argos, which was thus in some measure recompensed for her exclusion from the list of free communities. One important and singular state still has to be mentioned. On the northern lip of the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, near the scene of the great battle in which he won the lordship of the Roman world, Augustus founded a new city. Nicopolis, the city of victory, rose on the very spot where the main body of his army had been encamped. This foundation was not to be a Roman colony. It was to be a Greek city like Thessalonica, and it was founded in the same way, by synchronizing the small communities of the neighborhood. Nicopolis, like Athens and Sparta, was a free and sovereign state. Acarnania, the island of Leucas, the neighborhood districts of Epirus, a part of Aetolia, were placed under her control. On the opposite promontory, a new temple of Apollo was built at Actium, and quinquennial games were instituted in honor of that god, on the model of the Olympian, and actually called Olympian as well as Actian. The cycle of 4 years was an Actiad. Nicopolis and its dependents belonged politically neither to Macedonia nor to Achaia, but they were more in touch with the southern than with the northern province. The great bond of union among the European Greeks under Roman rule was the Delphic Amphictyony, and in this assembly, as reorganized by Augustus, Nicopolis had a prominent place. The chief reform introduced by that emperor was the extension of the institution to Macedonia and Nicopolis, but as many votes were assigned to the new city as to the whole of the Macedonian province. The functions of the Amphictyony were purely religious. It ordered the sacred festivals and administered the large income of the temple of Delphi. From a political point of view, it served the same purpose as the assembly of the 3 Gallic provinces which met at Lyons round the altar of Augustus. It helped to maintain a feeling of unity and a sense of common nationality. Section 2. Asia Minor. Kingdoms of the Euxine. Islands. Asia and Bithynia. From the Greeks of the motherland we pass to the Greeks of Lesser Asia. Here Rome had never to struggle for dominion as in the other parts of the empire of Alexander the Great and his successors. The provinces of Asia and Bithynia dropped, as it were, into her arms. Asia was the kingdom of the Attalids of Pergamum, and was bequeathed to the Roman people by Attalus III. Bithynia became Roman in the same way by the testament of King Nicomedes. Both these provinces were assigned to the Senate and governed by proconsuls. Asia extended from the shores of the Propontis to the borders of Lycia. Eastward it included Phrygia, and on the west took in the islands along the coast. Bithynia was no longer confined to the original kingdom of Nicomedes. It had been increased on the east side by Pontus, after the overthrow of the empire of Mithridates by Pompey, and it stretched along the Bosphorus into Europe, so as to take in Byzantium. In the kingdom of the Attalids, little was left for the Romans to do in the way of Hellenization. In the interior of the country there were many Hellenistic cities, and the growth of city life required no fostering from the new mistress. The colonies of Parium and Alexandria in the Troas, founded by Augustus, were for the purpose of settling veteran soldiers. It was otherwise in the kingdom of Nicomedes. Here Greek culture had not taken root so deeply or so widely. Bithynia was far less developed than Asia. Here, accordingly, there was room for Rome to step in and carry on the work of Hellenization, and she gladly undertook the task. Pontus, which was under the governor of Bithynia, was more backward still. There were no Greek centers there, like Prusa and Nicaea in Bithynia, so that the Hellenization of that country practically began under the empire. The 2 most important towns on the coast of Pontus were Sinope, where a Roman colony had been planted, and Trapezus, which was the station of the Pontic fleet. In Asia Minor, as in other parts of the empire, Augustus promoted the institution of provincial councils. The deputies of various cities met yearly in a center, and the assembly could make known to the Roman governor the wishes of the province. But this institution took a special shape and color by its association with the worship of the Emperor. In 29 B.C., Caesar, not yet Augustus, authorized the diets of Asia and Bithynia to build temples to himself in Pergamum and Nicomedia. Hence the custom of paying divine honors to the Emperor during his lifetime spread throughout the provinces. In Italy and Rome such worship was not yielded to him till he was deified after his death. This worship involved the existence of high priests, who in the Asiatic provinces became very important persons and gave their names to the year. Whereas in European Greece the ancient public festivals, Olympian, Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean, still lived, and the new Actian feast was celebrated in honor of Apollo. In Asia the public feasts were connected with the cult of the emperor. The president of the provincial diet, the Asiarch in Asia, and the Bithyniarch in Bithynia, conducted the celebration of these festivals and defrayed the costs, so that those offices could only be held by rich men. There was no lack of wealthy folk in Asia, the province of 500 cities. It had suffered a good deal from piracy and from the Mithridatic War, and Augustus, in order to restore prosperity, resorted to the measure of cancelling old debts. Rhodes was the only state that did not take advantage of this permission. But Asia soon recovered, and her bright cities enjoyed under the empire tranquillity and prosperity. 4. Galatia and Pamphylia. When the provinces were divided in 27 B.C. between the Senate and the emperor, Asia Minor was only in small part provincial. Besides Asia and Bithynia, only eastern Cilicia was subject to a Roman governor. The rest of the country consisted of dependent states, holding the same relation to Rome as Mauritania in the west. Chief among these vassal states was the kingdom of Galatia, then ruled by Amyntas. Celtic civilization held its own for a long time against Hellenism in this miniature Gaul, which was set down in the land of Hellenistic states, somewhat like Massilia, that miniature Greece set down in the land of Celtic cantons. The visitor who came from western Galatia, the Greek name of Gaul, to eastern Galatia, might hear spoken in the streets of Pessinus and Ancyra the language with which he was familiar in the streets of Lugudunum. Here, too, in the New Gaul, were the same double names of towns as in the Old Gaul, the name of the place and the name of the tribe. As Gallic Mediolanum is Santes, saints, as Lutetia is Parisi, so Ancyra is called by the name of the Tectosages, Pessinus by that of the Tolistobogii. But in Asia the Celts did not long maintain the purity of their race. Gallic and Greek blood were mingled, and the people were called Gallo-Greeks, just as in Gaul they came to be Gallo-Romans. The princes of Galatia were ambitious of empire, and were rivals of Mithridates. In the Mithridatic War they stood fast by Rome. King Deiotarus, who had played a prominent part then, died in 40 B.C., and his kingdom passed to one of his officers, Amyntas, in 36 B.C., through the favor of Marcus Antonius, who charged the new sovereign with the subjugation of Pisidia. The dominion of Amyntas extended over these mountainous countries south of Galatia, which have always been so hard to civilize: Pisidia, Lycaonia, Isauria, and western Cilicia. The fall of his patron Antonius made no difference in the position of Amyntas. Caesar allowed him to remain where he was. But when he died in 25 B.C., Galatia was transformed into a Roman province, and, like all new provinces after 27 B.C., was administered by an imperial governor. Pamphylia, over which the authority of Amyntas stretched, was now separated from Galatia and made a distinct province, but Pisidia and Lycaonia still went with Galatia. In the mountainous regions of these districts the Hellenistic kings had done little for civilization, and there was a great field for the plantation of new cities. Antioch, Seleucia, Apollonia in northern Pisidia, Iconium, and Laodicea Catacaecumene in Lycaonia were indeed something, but they were only a beginning. Augustus founded the Roman colonies of Lystra and Palaris in Lycaonia, and Cremna in Pisidia, and his successors carried on the work. Many remains of theatres and aqueducts in these lands tell of prosperity under the early empire. But even at the best of times Mount Taurus was the home of wild mountaineers, always ready, under a weak government, to pursue the trade of brigandage. 5. The dependent states in Asia Minor and on the Euxine. The rest of Asia Minor did not become provincial until after the death of Augustus. During his reign the Lycian confederacy, once subject to Rhodes but independent after the Third Macedonian War, was permitted to retain its autonomy. The kingdom of Cappadocia was ruled by King Archelaus. Polemon ruled over a Pontic kingdom, consisting of the territory between Caressus and Trapezus, and also the land of Colchis. There were 3 distinct vassal states in Cilicia. In Paphlagonia there were some small principalities held by the descendants of King Deiotarus, but these came to an end in 7 B.C. and were joined to Galatia. East of Galatia, north of Cappadocia, was the kingdom of Little Armenia, of which more will be said in the next chapter, where the position of Great Armenia will also be described, a kingdom dependent by turns on the Roman and the Parthian empires. One state, or rather 2 states, which up till very late times continued Roman dependencies, not incorporated in the provincial system, still call for notice. These are the 2 cities on the Tauric peninsula, Bosphorus, or Panticapaium, on the eastern promontory at the entrance of the Palus Mæotis, and Chersonesus, or Heraclea, at the opposite western side. Bosporus was governed by kings. The original title was Archon, who also ruled over Phanagoria on the opposite mainland and Theodosia, a town on the peninsula. Chersonesus was a republic. Both states had been conquered by Mithridates and formed into a Bosporan realm. When he was overthrown, Bosphorus, after some struggles, came finally into the hands of Asandros, who held it until his death, 16 B.C., and left the kingdom to his wife Dynamis. By marriage with her and the permission of Augustus, Polemon, king of Pontus, then obtained the kingdom and was succeeded by his children. But the republic of the western city was no longer subject to its eastern neighbor, though it might regard the Basileus of Bosphorus as a protector in times of need. These cities on the distant border of Scythia played an important part in commerce. The Greek colonies on the northern shore of the Euxine, Tyrus at the mouth of the river of like name, Olbia near the mouth of the Hypanis, although they sometimes received Roman protection, never took a permanent place in the empire. Lonely and remote, they were left to hold their own, as best they could, in the midst of barbarous peoples. Cyprus, Crete, and Cyrene. In the western Mediterranean there were 2 insular provinces, Cilicia and Sardinia. So likewise in the eastern parts of the same sea there were 2 insular provinces, Cyprus and Crete. Crete, however, was not an entire province. It had been joined by its conqueror Metellus with the Cyrenaic Pentapolis. The joint province of Crete and Cyrene was assigned to the Senate. The land of Cyrene, remarkable for its delightful, invigorating climate, was also blessed by freedom from political troubles throughout its history as a Roman province. Like Asia and Bithynia, it had been willed to the Roman Republic by Ptolemy Apion, its last Macedonian king, 96 B.C. Cyprus was at first imperial, but in 22 B.C. Augustus transferred it, along with Gallia Narbonensis, to the Senate. The early history of this island had turned, like that of Sicily, on the struggle between the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Under Roman rule, it would have enjoyed unbroken tranquility, but for the large population of Jews who sometimes rebelled. Even the peaceful Cyrenaica was at times disturbed by the agitations of the same race. Crete, once the home of piracy, was lucky enough to play no part in history as long as the Mediterranean was a wholly Roman sea. End of chapter 7, sections 1 and 2. Chapter 7, parts 3 and 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Students' Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 7, Parts 3 and 4. Section 3. The neighboring dependent kingdoms in Syria. Of the imperial provinces, Syria was the most important in the east, as Gaul in the west. The legatus of Syria, on whom it devolved to defend the frontier of the Euphrates against the Parthians, had 4 legions under him, the same number that was stationed on the Rhine. But it was not only for frontier service that the Syrian troops were needed. They had also to protect the cities and the villages against marauding bands who infested the hills. Hence the legions were quartered in the cities, and not, like the Rhine army, in special military stations on the frontier. And this circumstance was the source of the demoralization and the lack of discipline which marked the Syrian army. But notwithstanding the existence of the hill robbers, Syria was a most prosperous province. In the way of Hellenization and the colonization, the Seleucid kings had left nothing for the Romans to do. Augustus founded Berytus in order to provide for veteran soldiers, and it remained an isolated Italian town in the midst of the Greek Asiatics, like Corinth in Greece and Alexandria in the Troad. The Greek names of the towns in Syria were called Macedonia, as towns in Sicily and Magna Graecia were called Old Greece, or as names of places in the United States were called the mother country. But the older Aramaic names lived on side by side with the new Greek names, and in some cases have outlived them, as for instance Heliopolis, which is called Baalbec at the present day. People too had double names as well as places. Thomas, who was called Didymus, and Tabitha, also called Dorcas in the New Testament, are familiar examples. The Aramaic tongue continued to be spoken beside Greek, like Celtic beside Latin in Gaul, especially in the remoter districts. From the mixture of Greek and Syrian life, a new mixed type of civilization arose, sometimes called Syro-Hellenic, and characteristically expressed in the great mausoleum erected on a hill near the Euphrates by Antiochus, king of Comagene. In his epitaph, that monarch prays that upon his posterity may descend the blessings of the gods both of Persis and Maketis, Persia and Makedonia. In the busy factories of the great Syrian cities, Laodicea, Apamea, Tyre, Berytus, Byblus, were carried on the manufactures, linen, silk, etc., for which the country was so famous. But Antioch, the capital, was a town of pleasure rather than of work. It was not well situated for commerce, like Alexandria, but it was rich and magnificent, splendidly supplied with water, brightly lit up at night, and full of superb buildings. It, with its suburbs, the Gardens of Daphne, was probably the pleasantest town in the empire for the pleasure seeker. Southern Syria, on its eastern side, bordered on the dependent kingdom of Nabat, which extended from Damascus, encircling Palestine on the east and south, and included the northern portion of the Arabian Peninsula. The regions, however, of Trachontis, between Damascus and Bostra, which had been committed to the charge of Zenodorus, prince of Abila, were subsequently transferred by Augustus to the king of Judea, because Zenodorus, instead of suppressing the robbers who infested Trachontis, made common cause with them. Damascus itself, however, was subject to the Nabatean kings, whose capital was the great commercial city of Petra, the midway station through which the caravans of Indian merchandise passed on their road from Leucecoma in Arabia to Gaza. These kings were Arabs, and Hellenism had only superficially touched their court. They had officers named Aparchoi and Strategoi. In the northern part of their realm, Damascus was Greek, and the close neighborhood of Syria brought those border regions on the edge of the desert into connection with Greek civilization. The kings of Petra were always at feud with their neighbors, the kings of Judea. Obodas nearly lost his crown for taking up arms against Herod instead of appealing to Augustus, their common lord. Civilization did not really begin for this Nabatean kingdom until, more than a century later, it was at length converted into a Roman province. The kingdom of Judea, restored and bestowed upon Antipater of Idumea by Julius Caesar, had been specially favored by that statesman, being exempted from tribute and military levies. After the death of Antipater, the kingdom was won by his son Herod after many struggles. At first the unwilling client of Antonius and the Queen of Egypt, he performed some services in the final contest for Caesar, who not only confirmed him in his kingdom, but enlarged its borders. Samaria was added to Judea, and also the line of coast from Gaza as far as the Tower of Straton, which afterwards, under Herod's rule, was to become the city of Caesarea, the chief port of southern Syria. Herod, throughout his long reign, prosecuted the work of Hellenism, by no means acceptable to his Jewish subjects, with generous zeal. His policy was to keep religion and the government of the state quite apart, and do away altogether with the Jewish theocracy. There was thus a continuous rivalry between the king and the high priest. The Hellenism of Herod was shown by his building a theatre at Jerusalem, and instituting a festival to be celebrated at the end of every 4th year, in imitation of the Greek games. At this festival musical as well as gymnastic and equestrian contests were held, and people of every nation were invited. He also imitated the Romans by building an amphitheatre in the plain beneath the city, and exhibiting there combats of wild beasts and condemned criminals. All this was a gross violation of Jewish traditions. Herod founded 2 new cities, both of which were named after the emperor. Caesarea, already mentioned, intended to be the seaport of Jerusalem, and Sebaste, on the site of Samaria. These cities were of Hellenistic and not Jewish character. The reign of Herod was stained by horrible tragedies which darkened his domestic life. Before his death, which occurred in 4 B.C., his kingdom had been increased by the land beyond the Jordan. The whole realm he divided among his 3 sons. Archelaus was to receive Judea, with Samaria and Idumea. To Philip fell Batanea and the adjacent regions, with the title of Tetrarch, while Galilee and the land beyond the Jordan was assigned to Herod Antipas, also as Tetrarch. But the kingdom was not destined to be of long duration. The Jews preferred to be the direct subjects of the emperor to being under the rule of a king of their own, and a deputation from Jerusalem waited upon Augustus in Rome to pray him to abolish the kingdom. The emperor at first compromised. He did not remove Archelaus from the government of Judea, but he refused him the royal title and deprived him of Samaria. A few years later, however, in consequence of the incapacity of Archelaus, the wishes of the Jews were accomplished, and Judea was made a Roman province (6 A.D.) under an imperial procurator, over whom doubtless the legatus of Syria was empowered to exercise a certain supervision, in certain cases, somewhat as the governor of Pannonia might intervene in Noricum. Under the procurator, the city communities were allowed to manage their own affairs, as in Asia or Achaia. In Jerusalem, the Sanhedrion, an institution which had been founded under the Seleucids, corresponded to the town council, and the high priest, appointed by the procurator to the chief magistrate. Everything possible was done, under the new system, to respect and deal tenderly with the customs and prejudices of the Jews. Out of consideration for their objection to images, the coins did not bear the emperor's head, and when Roman soldiers went to Jerusalem, they had to leave their standards behind them in Caesarea. The difference of treatment which the Occidental Jews experienced is striking. The same emperors who persecuted Jews in the West scrupulously respected their customs in their own land. But the Jews were not content. They grumbled against the tribute, not because it was oppressive, but on the ground that it was irreligious. This state of things resulted in the great Jewish war of Vespasian, to which we shall come hereafter. Some other small vassal states were allowed to survive for a considerable time. The kingdom of Commagene in the north was not incorporated in the provincial system until 72 A.D. The principality of Chalcis, northwest of Damascus, survived still longer, until 92 A.D. Abila, between Chalcis and Damascus, was annexed about 49 A.D. Iamblichus of Emesa had been executed by Antonius shortly before the battle of Actium, and his territory was at first annexed by Augustus to the province of Syria, but in 20 B.C. restored to a member of the native dynasty of Sampigaramus. It finally became provincial before 81 A.D. At what time the Syrian state of Palmyra called in the Syrian tongue Tadmor, came to be a Roman dependency, we cannot say for certain, but probably in the reign of Augustus. This flourishing city, situated in an oasis of desert, lay on the trade route from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean Sea, and was governed under Roman supremacy by its own municipal officers, until its destruction by the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century. Section 4. Egypt. The death of Cleopatra, the last queen of the royal house of the Legedi, was followed by the conversion of Egypt from the condition of a vassal kingdom into a directly subject land. But although it is never counted with the imperial provinces, it never stood in line with the other provinces. It was the subject to the emperor in his own right, not merely as representative of the populus Romanus. Augustus ruled over Egypt, not as proconsul, but as the successor of the Ptolemies, a king all but in name, and the country always remained a sort of imperial preserve. The emperor was worshipped as a god by the Egyptian priests, according to the same forms which had been used in the cult of the royal Ptolemies. It was a logical consequence of this legal status of Egypt, as the emperor's private domain, that it should stand apart from the imperial provinces in its administration. Thus senators were disqualified to fill the post of governor. Hence the governor of Egypt did not hold the rank of a legatus, but only of a praefectus. He was in command, however, of 3 legions, and this was the only case in which legions were commanded by men of the equestrian order. But not only were senators excluded from the governorship, they were even forbidden to set foot in the land without permission of the lord of the land. This regulation, which also extended to equites illustres, was made by Augustus in self-protection, for if a prominent senator wished to excite a rebellion, Egypt, through its immense resources and its geographical position, would have made a most favorable field for such an enterprise. The military importance had been abundantly proved in the civil war. Whoever controlled the Egyptian ports could stop the corn supply on which Rome and Italy depended, and thus force them to capitulate without leaving Alexandria. And besides, Egypt was a country difficult to attack and easy to defend. It had the advantage of an insular position without being an island. The jealousy with which the emperors watched Egypt is illustrated by the fate of the first prefect, Cornelius Gallus, the poet. He allowed his name and deeds to be inscribed on the pyramids, and these indiscretions were interpreted as treasonable. Tried by the Senate, he was removed from his command, and his disgrace drove him to commit suicide. Augustus is reported on this occasion to have complained that he was the only citizen who could not show anger against a friend without making him an enemy. Besides the prefect, there was a Euridicus to administer justice, and an officer called Aedilogos to manage the finances. In organization also, Egypt differed from the other provinces. The system of the Ptolemies was continued. No municipal self-government was granted. City life was not encouraged, as in the rest of the empire. The country was divided into districts, nomes, which were placed under officers appointed by the government. No diet was instituted to represent the political views of the people. Under the Ptolemies, the native Egyptians had formed an inferior class, possessing no political privileges, and under the Romans their condition remained the same. Upper Egypt extended to Elephantine on the Nile, and to Troglodytic Berenice on the coast, in the same line of latitude. This Berenice must be distinguished from Golden Berenice, far away to the south, opposite Aden, which, like Zula and Ptolemais Theron, were not included in the Roman Empire. The fertility of the land of the Nile was proverbial, and it brought in an enormous revenue to the imperial purse. Augustus did not reduce the heavy taxes which had been levied by his Greek predecessors, but by judicious improvements, among which must be especially mentioned the reopening and clearing of the Nile canals, he enabled the country to bear them, and Egypt soon recovered from the financial distress in which the rule of Cleopatra had plunged it. The chief product was grain, in which it supplied Rome. In the production of linen, Egypt rivaled Syria. In glass manufactures it stood first, and it supplied the world with papyrus. Excellently situated for traffic, Alexandria might claim to be the second city in the empire, As a center of commerce, she then stood at the head of all the cities in the world. The traffic of the East and the West met in her streets and on her quays. Greek philosophies and Oriental religions mingled in her schools. The buildings were magnificent, above all the Temple of Serapis, the Museum, and the Royal Palace. There were attractions for the scholar as well as for the merchant and the sightseer. The Greek library was the richest, and the Greek professors of the museums the most learned in the empire. Everything, a Greek writer says, was to be had in Egypt: wealth, quiet, sights, philosophers, gold, a museum, wine, all one may desire. There was a very large Jewish population in Alexandria, composing a distinct community with its own chief, entitled the Ethnarch, and the city was too often the scene of riots and tumults, as was wont to be the case where there were large colonies of Jews. The capture of Alexandria by Caesar was commemorated by the building of a suburb called Nicopolis, which served as a sort of fortress to command the city, as a legion was stationed there. The temple of Antonius, incomplete when the city was taken, was finished and dedicated to Caesar. At a later period Augustus set up an obelisk in Alexandria, which survives to the present day, although no longer in its old station, under the name of Cleopatra's Needle. Egypt had been accustomed to reckon time by the regnal year of the Ptolemies, and the same system was continued under its new sovereign. The era of the first Roman ruler was counted, not from his day of victory, August 1st, 30 B.C., but from August 29th, corresponding to the first day of the month Thoth, which the Egyptians reckoned as the first day of the new year. Cleopatra survived during the greater part of August, and this circumstance may have determined the choice of the beginning of the new era. List of provinces at the death of Augustus. 1. Senatorials. A. Governed by consular proconsuls: Asia, Africa. B. Governed by praetorian proconsuls: Sicily, Baetica, Narbonensis, Macedonia, Achaia, Bithynia and Pontus, Cyprus, Crete and Cyrene. 2. Imperial. A. Governed by legati Augusti praetorii. 1. Governed by consular legati: Tarraconensis, Pannonia, Dalmatica, Moesia, Syria. 2. Governed by praetorian legati: Lusitania, Aquitania, Lugudunensis, Belgica, Galatia. B. Governed by prefects or procurators: Egypt, prefect; Sardinia and Corsica, Rhaetia, prefect; Noricum, Alpes Maritimi, prefect; Alpes Cottae, prefect; Judea, procurator. End of chapter 7, sections 3 and 4.